In 1913, Barry Docks exported 11.05 million tonnes of coal and coke in a single year, more than any harbour on the planet. 42 years earlier, the site had held roughly 100 people. It had no cathedral, no castle, no centuries of trade behind it. It had a tidal sandbank, a stretch of open coast, and a Welsh railway builder named David Davies, who refused to keep paying the tolls demanded by the family that controlled every other port in South Wales. By 1914, the population had grown to 38,000. Davies fought for the right to build his own harbour for years, won it in Parliament after a £70,000 legal battle, watched the first ships load coal in 1889, and died within a year of opening day, before anyone could tell him how big it would get. Today, the same stretch of coast is known for a television sitcom filmed on its beach, and the town beside the empty docks ranks among the poorest in Wales. This is the story of a place built from almost nothing, that rose to lead the world not once, but twice, and came down twice, for two entirely different reasons. Chapter 1. The Island That Wasn't One. Barry Island is not, in the strict sense, an island. It is a peninsula of sand off the coast of the Vale of Glamorgan on the Bristol Channel, joined to the mainland town that grew up around it by a strip of ground the sea covers and uncovers twice a day. On the seaward side lies Whitmore Bay, and it was there from the 1790s that the first visitors arrived. Not colliers, not dock workers, but the leisured classes of Bristol and Bath, come for the genteel ritual of sea bathing that Georgian England had made fashionable up and down its coasts. They came in the warm months and were gone by autumn. A seasonal population of a different order entirely from the one the island would later hold. Bathing, in that era, was not swimming. It was a prescribed act taken for the health of the constitution as much as for pleasure. Performed at a modest distance from the gaze of the shore, the bather lowered into the water and drawn back out with as little display as the ritual allowed. Whitmore Bay offered the two things that ritual required: open sand and a clean run of tide, and asked nothing else of the people who used it. For nearly a century, that was the whole of it. No dock. Nothing here answered to a railway, a harbour wall, a crane, or a warehouse. Only tide-washed sand, a bay that filled and emptied on its own schedule, and a scatter of bathers who arrived by whatever means the coast allowed and left no permanent mark on it. The place had no economic weight, no strategic value, nothing to distinguish it from a dozen other stretches of Welsh coastline where the tide ran in and out over empty flats. Nothing was built here that could not be undone by a single winter storm, and so nothing was. Until 1896, reaching the island meant submitting to the tide's own timetable, not one written by any company or authority. You could wait for low water and walk out across sand firm enough to hold a footstep, then onto the darker mud of the channel bed itself, ground that sucked at the boot and forced a slower, more deliberate pace than open ground ever demanded. The crossing had to be timed against a falling and rising sea, begun early enough to clear the flats before the water turned, finished before the incoming tide erased the path a walker had just used. There was no rail to hold, no causeway underfoot, only sand read by eye and by habit, and the low grey line of the channel to watch while you crossed it. Or you could take the water itself aboard one of the paddle steamers of the Yellow Funnel Line, which ran the crossing from Bristol, from Clevedon, from Weston-super-Mare. These were vessels built for exactly this trade, flat-bottomed enough to work the shallow approaches, engined to hold a schedule the tide itself would not keep, carrying their passengers over the same water the walkers would cross on foot a few hours later, once the sea had drawn back off it. Paddle wheels churning brown water, funnel smoke laid flat along the channel by the wind, a deck crowded with people bound for a bay that had no pier yet to receive them. That was the other way in. Picture that crossing as it was then. A line of figures moving out across open sand, the mainland at their backs, the sea somewhere beyond the horizon and already turning to come back. Twice a day the crossing existed. Twice a day it vanished beneath water, indifferent to whoever still stood on it. Nothing about that sandbank, walked and steamed to by bathers in search of nothing more than clean air and a modest dip in the channel, suggested what it would carry within a generation. Not bathers now, but coal, and not by the boatload, but by the millions of tons. 25 miles up the coast, in the docks at Cardiff, a different problem was taking shape. The Bute family had built and controlled the port that handled almost all of the coal pouring out of the Rhondda valleys, and by the 1880s that port could not move it fast enough. Ships queued in the roads for days waiting on a berth. Coal owners paid the delay in lost contracts. One of them, a Rhondda colliery owner named David Davies, had been counting those days and counting what they cost him. He had begun looking not at Cardiff, but at the empty sandbank 25 miles down the coast. Chapter 2. The Founders and the First Fortune. Barry Docks did not build itself. 25 miles up the coast, David Davies had already made one fortune before he thought about making another. He was a Welsh-born self-made industrialist who had left a Cardiganshire farm with almost nothing, worked as a sawyer and a timber merchant, then moved into railway contracting, driving lines into the Rhondda valleys where no engineer had wanted to go. He owned collieries of his own by the 1860s, and the coal from those collieries had to leave Wales through Cardiff, through the Bute docks, on a schedule the Bute family controlled, and Davies did not. A monopoly port meant exactly that. One family set the dues. It also decided which ship took a berth this week and which one waited its turn in the roads, and it had no particular reason to spend money widening a channel that was already making it rich without doing so. Coal that could not move sat in wagons, in sidings, in stockpiles that cost money simply by existing, while buyers on the other end of the contract looked for a supplier who could deliver on time. Davies had been counting those delays for years, tallying them the way he tallied the cost of a stalled railway contract. Now he counted a different number, the price of not waiting any longer. He was not alone in the arithmetic. A group of fellow Rhondda colliery owners, men who shipped their coal through the same bottleneck and absorbed the same losses, joined Davies in promoting a rival scheme. A new dock built from nothing on a stretch of foreshore at Barry that was then little more than a hamlet on the edge of the Bristol Channel. The Bute family fought it with everything a monopoly could buy. Lawyers, petitions, a campaign in the committee rooms of Westminster designed to bury the bill before it ever reached a vote. The fight dragged through session after session until the colliery owners had spent £70,000 defending a scheme that had not yet moved a single ton of coal. Money spent purely on the right to build. In 1884, Parliament passed the Barry Dock and Railways Act. That November, Lord Windsor cut the first sod, and the digging began. What followed was 5 years of moving a sandbank. Several hundred men worked the site through all weather, cutting a sea lock and dock basins out of ground that had never carried anything heavier than grazing sheep, laying temporary rail spurs to haul stone and machinery in and spoil out, driving and setting gates built to hold back a tidal range among the largest anywhere in the world. Barry, until then a name on a map and little else, became a permanent construction camp. Sheds for tools, huts for foremen, a settlement of labourers living beside a hole in the ground that would decide whether the money already spent had been worth spending. Every basin dug, every gate hung, was a debt against a coal trade that had not yet sent a single wagon through it. Barry Docks opened for trade in 1889. David Davies did not get long to watch it work. He died in 1890, 1 year after the achievement that would define the settlement he had willed into existence out of a hamlet and a stretch of foreshore. He did not live to see how far the numbers he had started still had to climb. In 1871, the hamlet at Barry had counted roughly 100 residents. By 1914, 24 years after Davies's death, that figure stood at 38,000. They arrived from across the globe, farm labourers walking in from the Vale of Glamorgan and the English West Country, navvies moving on from finished railway contracts elsewhere in Britain, sailors and stevedores off ships that called at ports from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and beyond. A hamlet grew streets, terraces, chapels and schools to hold them. All of it built after Davies was in the ground, all of it still climbing when the docks reached the record that made his name. The docks kept growing. So did the town around them, and on the sandbank beside the new harbour, a stretch of coast nobody had built anything on yet. A different class of visitor was about to start arriving, carried not by coal wagons, but by an ordinary passenger railway. Chapter 3. The Railway and the Pleasure Park. The railway solved a problem the harbour never touched. For as long as anyone could remember, reaching the island beyond the docks had meant timing the crossing to the tide on foot, or paying for a place on a paddle steamer, a novelty crossing that suited a handful of trippers, and no one running a business on the strength of it. In 1896, a rail link finally reaches Barry Island itself, laid down almost as an afterthought to the docks that made it possible, and in a single stroke an empty sandbank becomes something else entirely. a resort with a timetable. Trains do not care about tides. They arrive on schedule, in numbers the paddle steamers never carried and never could, and the sand that had sat untouched for centuries acquires, almost overnight, an economic reason to exist. Land that had been worth nothing to anyone but gulls now has a station standing on it, and a timetable printed for a place that, a decade earlier, had no name worth printing. What grows on that land in the following year is modest at first, almost accidental. In 1897, Barry Island Pleasure Park begins life as nothing more than a seasonal fair pitched directly on the sand of Whitmore Bay. Not a park in any landscape sense, an actual fairground of stalls and rides erected each season and struck down again once the crowds went home. The White brothers hold the beach concession, the right to profit from whatever amusement can be built where the tide allows it. There is no masonry here, no permanence, nothing resembling the granite and iron rising half a mile away at the docks. Just canvas, timber and sand, rented out one summer at a time, dismantled every autumn as if it had never been there. The railway makes that fragile arrangement viable within months. On a single August bank holiday weekend, more than 150,000 people arrive on the island. Men, women and children pouring off trains built for coal traffic and cargo schedules, not day trippers, pressed into a rush nobody at the company had planned for. It is a number that belongs to no other stretch of the Welsh coast that decade. The line laid to move steam coal to the docks is, for one weekend at a time, moving people instead, and the sandbank that had never held a permanent building in its history now holds more visitors in 2 days than most towns in the county see across an entire season. That growth does not stop with the century. By 1934, the traffic the 1896 line first produced has swelled into more than 400,000 visitors across the August bank holiday week alone. A figure reached decades on, once the fair had hardened into something closer to an institution than a seasonal tent, with permanent stalls where the White brothers once pitched canvas. That later chapter belongs elsewhere in this story. What matters here, in 1897, is the direction the number was already pointing, sharply upward and within a single year of the railway's arrival. Barry in these years is, in effect, two industries occupying the same few hundred acres and barely acknowledging each other. On one side of the peninsula, coal wagons queue toward docks built to move a commodity by the million tons, financed by ironmasters, bound for furnaces on the other side of the world. On the other side, a beach concession sells rides and ices to families who arrive for an afternoon and will be gone again by nightfall, carrying nothing home but sand in their shoes. Coal on one side, sand and fairground on the other. Between them, less than a mile of Glamorgan coastline and no obvious sign that either trade limits the other's growth. Whitmore Bay's crowds do not slow the docks, and the docks do not slow Whitmore Bay. Both keep expanding through the same years on the same stretch of coast for the same underlying reason. A railway had made Barry reachable, and reachability, once created, does not discriminate between coal and holidaymakers. The docks, though, were about to post a tonnage figure of their own, one that had nothing to do with bank holidays or fairground takings, and that no one on either side of the peninsula had predicted. Chapter 4. Two booms at once. The figure arrived in 1913, and it closed an argument that had been running since the first coal wagon reached the coast. Barry Docks exported 11,050,000 tonnes of coal and coke that year, more than any harbour on the planet moved in the same 12 months. Not the busiest port in Wales, not the busiest port in Britain. The busiest port anywhere coal was loaded onto a ship, full stop. Cardiff, the rival that had once refused Barry a foothold, did not match it. Newcastle did not match it. A parish of marshland and scattered farms, unknown outside its own county 30 years before, had become the place where more of the world's coal changed hands than anywhere else on it. Every tip, every siding, every coal trimmer working the hold since the docks first opened had been aimed, without anyone saying so, at a total exactly like this one. The record would not be matched again, not by Barry, not by any port that came after it, and the town seems to have understood this even as the tonnage was still being counted. No plaque marks the exact week the total was reached. No committee convened to celebrate it. The number simply stood, filed alongside shipping returns and export tables, a fact that mattered enormously to men who worked in coal and to almost no one else outside the trade. Within a year, the war would begin reshaping demand for everything the docks moved. The peak, once reached, was not repeated. It did not need to be. A record set once and never approached again is a monument in its own right, quieter than the ones cut in stone. 10 years later, the other trade on the peninsula got a permanence of its own. In 1923, Barry Town Council paved a new promenade along the seafront. Brick and concrete laid where the crowds had previously stood on packed sand and duckboards, exposed to whatever the tide left behind. The pleasure park, which had spent its first years pitched directly on the beach among the same canvas booths and travelling rides described in the summer before, moved off the sand entirely and onto this new surface. It was no longer a fair that arrived with the season, and could, in principle, be struck and carted away by autumn, its rides packed onto lorries and its booths folded flat. It had a foundation now laid by the same council that had once argued over gas lamps and bathing huts, and the foundation did not move with the tide, did not wash out with a bad storm, did not need to be rebuilt each spring the way the old sand-pitch stalls had. The parallel was not planned by anyone, but it is difficult to miss in retrospect. The docks reached their permanent, unrepeatable peak in 1913. The seafront reached its permanent, unremovable form in 1923. Coal built its record in tonnage. Leisure built its record in brick and concrete. Both were, in their own currency, statements that Barry had stopped being provisional. A booming coal port and a booming holiday resort, occupying the same 6 miles of coastline, arrived within a single decade of each other at the same conclusion. This was no longer a place people passed through on the way to somewhere permanent. It was the permanent place built to last twice over by two industries that shared almost nothing except the railway that had made both of them possible in the first place. Neither peak announced itself as a peak. Coal kept moving through the 20s, tonnage rising and falling with markets no one on the docks controlled. Trippers kept arriving on the excursion trains, filling the new promenade the council had just poured, the newest permanent surface the town had ever built. But the shape of what Barry would become, the fullest, most crowded, most photographed version of itself, was still a few years off, waiting on a decade that had not yet started. It would arrive in the 1930s on that same stretch of concrete, worn smoother by then by 10 more years of footsteps, and it would arrive, in part, through a boy who had not yet set foot in Barry at all. Chapter 5. The Fullest Expression. Picture Barry Island promenade on an August bank holiday Saturday in the 1930s. The excursion trains from the Rhondda valleys arrive in procession, disgorging tens of thousands of miners' families onto platforms built for a fraction of the number, and the crowd does not thin. It simply keeps arriving, carriage after carriage, until the concrete the council had poured a decade earlier disappears beneath feet. Paddle steamers dock at the pier on the same tide, unloading day trippers from Bristol and Weston who cross the channel for 6p and the promise of sand. Queues form for everything. For the steamer's return crossing, for deck chairs rented by the hour, for a patch of dry sand not already claimed by someone else's family. The fairground runs the length of the front, lit end to end even in daylight, carousels turning under painted canopies, swing boats hauled higher by boys competing for nothing but height. Coal dust has given way to candy floss on the wind, vinegar from the chip stalls, brine off the channel, and over it all the gulls wheel and drop for anything left unguarded on a blanket. Bunting strings between the lampposts, sun-bleached from the summer before. The noise is continuous. Steam whistles, brass band recordings looped through a tannoy, the particular shriek reserved for a swingboat's highest arc, the surf itself reduced to background under everything built to drown it out. A stretch of shoreline that had been marshland and mudflat 60 years earlier now holds, on a single Saturday, more people than most Welsh towns counted in a census. Nobody present could have told you the number. It would not have mattered. The point was never the count. It was the sensation of a place built for exactly this, absorbing a crowd it had spent 50 years preparing to receive without ever announcing that preparation as its purpose. Among the families who made that crossing at some point in the decade was a boy who had no family connection to Wales at all. Billy Butlin was an English-born child on holiday, one face in a promenade thick with them, and nothing about his visit marked him as different from the thousands of miners' sons around him chasing the same rides. What set the visit apart happened off the front, at a boarding house whose landlady kept strict hours and enforced them without exception. British seaside landladies of the period ran their houses on a fixed clock. Guests fed at set times and turned out of doors for the stretch between breakfast and an appointed evening hour, rain or shine, with no accommodation made for a child caught on the wrong side of the door. Butlin was locked out for the entire day, turned away at the door each time he tried to return, left to wait out the hours on a street he did not know, in a town that had promised him a holiday and delivered, instead, a closed door and a landlady's fixed schedule that cared nothing for the boy standing outside it. He never forgot it. The indignity of it stayed lodged in him the way certain childhood humiliations do, disproportionate to the event, permanent in a way the actual afternoon it consumed never could have predicted. He said nothing to anyone that mattered. He went home. The promenade behind him kept turning its carousels for the next family down the platform, indifferent to the boy who had just filed the day away. The fairground didn't know it had made an enemy, or a customer, or whatever Butlin would eventually become to it. It had other business. Attendance kept climbing through the decade, and management kept answering the climb the only way a seaside fairground knew how, with more machinery, more height, more speed, another ride to out-thrill the one built the summer before. Proprietors along the front competed openly for the same trippers, each season's investment measured against the last, publicity handed to the local papers before the paint had dried. The switchback and the helter-skelter, marvels a decade earlier, were by now just fixtures, absorbed into a skyline that expected to be topped again. Plans were already being drawn for the most ambitious structure the fairground had ever attempted, a ride meant to define that skyline the way those older machines once had. It would go up while newspapers a few pages past the holiday listings carried notices of rearmament, of conscription debates, of a continent rehearsing for something the trippers on the promenade were not. Yet naming. Barry Island kept building toward its own summit, unaware or unwilling to notice how little time remained before the trains stopped running for pleasure. Chapter 6. The Scenic Railway and the First Bombs. Barry Road and the streets of the West End had never seen a bomb before 1940. Neither had Cadoxton, nor the shelter belt of trees at Porthcurry Park, nor the ring of docks that had made the town's first fortune in coal. The pleasure park that same year opened its Scenic Railway, a wooden roller coaster built through a landscape of artificial mountains, its track threading between painted crags and plaster outcrops, meant to suggest the Alps to visitors who never left Wales. The timber structure rose in braced tiers, cross-latticed like a trestle bridge, its joints pinned rather than fixed rigid, so the frame could flex under load the way a ship's hull flexes under sea and settle back true. It was, by any measure, the most ambitious ride the fairground had built. It opened while the country had already been at war for the better part of a year. The dissonance did not announce itself with any fanfare. Newspapers carrying notices of the ride's opening also carried instructions on blackout discipline, windows sealed with tape and heavy curtain, street lamps hooded or extinguished, headlamps masked to a slit. Sandbags went up against shops and public buildings. Air raid wardens patrolled the same seafront where trippers had queued for the Scenic Railway months earlier, now checking for a crack of light behind a curtain. A coastal town at war lived a doubled life after dark, ice cream and deck chairs giving way each evening to a rehearsed discipline of shadow. Every port town on the Bristol Channel kept the same hours, dreaded the same droning approach from the sea. What made Barry a target was the harbour. The government understood this before most of the trippers riding the new coaster did, and had already strung a ring of barrage balloons along the waterline, silver-grey shapes tethered on steel cable and worked by ground crews. The balloons forced bombers away from low, accurate runs and up toward altitudes where their aim degraded. They floated above the same coal hoists, cranes and tips that had once made Barry the busiest coal-exporting port in the world. A curious inversion. Machinery built to move fuel, now sheltering under machinery built to stop fire. In April 1941, the bombs came anyway. They fell on houses in the West End, ordinary terraced streets never built to withstand explosive ordnance, and on Barry Road, where the damage was structural and immediate, walls open to the weather, roofs gone. Incendiary bombs fell separately and further out, scattering over Cadoxton and across the open ground of Porthcurry Park, igniting rather than shattering, catching in hedgerows and outbuildings. No reliable account survives here of how many were hurt or killed in that raid. What survives is the geography of impact. A residential district, a wooded park, a road named for the town itself, struck within hours of one another. The docks, the actual objective, held under the balloons and the gun positions. The houses near them did not have that protection and did not need to be the objective to be hit. There is a version of this story where the war is the villain, where German bombs finally broke Barry's coal trade and its confidence in its own permanence. That version does not hold up. The docks that the balloons guarded in 1941 were already exporting a fraction of what they had moved decades earlier and had been shrinking for years before the first incendiary ever reached Porthcurry Park. It started in the years right after the First War ended, in ledgers nobody at the fairground was reading. Chapter 7. The Quiet Erosion. The fairground's climb through the 1930s was not the whole story of the peninsula in those years. It was, in fact, the exception to it. While the rides on the western strip kept adding height and speed, the docks on the eastern side had already been losing ground for well over a decade, invisible from the promenade and irrelevant to the men riding the Scenic Railway. The coal trade's decline did not begin with a headline. It began in the years immediately after the First War, in shipping manifests and export tallies that showed less leaving Barry than had left it before. A slow bleeding rather than a wound. No single document marked the turn. The ledgers simply stopped climbing and then gradually stopped holding steady. That erosion had a decade to work before anything forced the town to look at it directly. The forcing came in May 1926, when the general strike closed the coalfield across South Wales in a single stroke. Miners, dockers and railwaymen walked out together, and for the first time since the port's earliest years, the collieries that fed it produced nothing at all. The strike itself lasted only days in most industries. In coal, the stoppage dragged on for months, the pits still shut when autumn came, still shut as the year wore toward winter. The Great Western Railway kept its trains running through all of it. Locomotives held to schedule, crews reported for duty. The timetables were honoured with the same discipline that had built the line's reputation. What the trains no longer carried, in any quantity worth the fuel, was coal. There was nothing at the pit heads to load. Wagons that had once queued for hours to be filled now sat coupled and empty, or ran their routes near enough to empty that the distinction hardly mattered. Machinery observing its schedule around an absence. It was, in its way, a more exact picture of the decline than any export figure could have offered. A railway performing perfectly, for a cargo that no longer existed to be moved. The mines reopened before the year was out and shipments resumed, but resumption was not recovery. Whatever share of the pre-war trade had survived the 1920s met a second reckoning within a few years, when the Great Depression settled over the export markets that Welsh coal had depended on since the port was cut into the coastline. Buyers on the continent and beyond had less to spend and other sources to spend it on. Barry's collieries kept working, but they were working into a market that had contracted on every side at once. First strike, then slump. By the time the decade closed, the arithmetic was no longer in doubt. The tonnage that had passed through the docks in the year before the First War was a ceiling, not a floor, and everyone who worked the coal trade in Barry understood, without needing it stated, that the port would not climb back over it. Not that year, not the next, not ever. The peak had already happened sometime before most of the men still loading the ships had taken the job. None of that arithmetic touched the fairground directly. Not yet. The rides kept turning. The crowds kept coming down from the valleys on their excursion trains, and the two economies of Barry, one rising, one falling, ran side by side through the 30s without much apparent connection between them. That separation would not last. The war would come and go, the docks would keep contracting through it and past it, and the fairground would keep climbing regardless, on a trajectory of its own. And somewhere in that post-war climb, a name would return to the town that once mattered to it in a smaller, harder way. The boy who had once waited outside a locked boarding house door for an entire day was grown now and rich and building an empire out of exactly the pleasure Barry Island sold by the day. He was coming back. Chapter 8. Enter Butlin. His name was Billy Butlin, and by the 1960s it meant something specific across Britain. He had built a fortune on a single insight about the British seaside. Left alone, it did not reward the ordinary holidaymaker, only tested him. A family arrived by train with a week's wages spent on the fare and found weather it could not control. Boarding houses that locked their doors between meals and turned guests out onto the front whether it rained or not, and evenings with nothing arranged and nowhere obliged to take them in. Butlin had lived that uncertainty from the wrong side of a locked door. By then he owned a chain of these camps stretching across the British coastline, each one built on the same promise, and he had become one of the wealthiest men in the holiday trade. The holiday camp was his answer, refined across more than a decade of camps elsewhere in Britain, before it reached Barry Island. A guest paid once in advance for a fixed week and received a chalet of his own, 3 meals served at set times, and a full programme of organised amusement. Swimming galas, talent contests, evening dances, run by staff in blazers the public had already learned to call redcoats. Nothing was left to the weather, and nothing was left for the guest himself to arrange. The camp was a resort sealed against the coast outside its own fence, and that sealing more than any single attraction inside it was what people were paying for. A family could walk in on a Saturday afternoon and not have to make a single decision for 7 days. In 1966, that formula arrived on Barry Island itself. Butlins opened a holiday camp on the same stretch of coast that had once turned away a soaked, exhausted boy. 800 chalets, built to hold 7,000 staying guests in a single week. It was larger than most of the town it stood beside, and it ran to a schedule the docks below it had never kept. For close to 2 decades afterward, Barry Island carried 2 economies at once, side by side, sharing a shoreline and almost nothing else. Along the docks, the coal trade kept contracting, cargo by cargo, as it had for years. Along the front, Butlins ran near full capacity through most weeks of the season. Coaches and trains delivering thousands who had booked their fortnight a year ahead and would spend almost none of it beyond the camp's own perimeter. One Barry Island was dying by tonnage, in figures the Port Authority kept, and nobody in the chalets ever saw. The other was thriving by the coachload, in numbers the docks never touched. They kept no ledger in common. By then he was older and rich, and the 800 chalets behind the gates at Barry Island guaranteed every one of his guests a bed, on paper, before they had even left home, booked, paid, and waiting, in a way the boarding house door of his childhood never had been. He had not built a memorial to that evening. He had simply built the one thing it had lacked. Not everything on the island welcomed the new arrival. Above the camp's ordered rows of chalets, the old fairground still ran its rides along the headland, the Scenic Railway creaking through its wooden turns, indifferent to redcoats and booked-in-advance certainty alike. It had survived 2 world wars, the slow bleed of the coal trade below it, and outlasted boarding houses, shipping lines, and half the businesses that once lined the front. It wouldn't last the decade. Chapter 9. The Second Blow. The end came from the sky, not from a balance sheet. In 1973, a gale swept in off the Bristol Channel and struck the headland where the Scenic Railway had stood since 1940. The coaster's wooden frame, built to flex under the rhythm of packed carriages taking the same turns thousands of times a season, was not built to be worked against by wind from every direction at once. Bracing that had held for 3 decades gave way under strain it was never designed to absorb. Joints loosened, then failed outright, until what remained standing was structurally beyond repair. The ride was demolished within the year, torn down piece by piece from the same headland it had dominated since before the war. A storm did in a single night what neither the blitz nor the slow bleed of the coal trade below it had managed in 30 years. Its absence changed the shape of the skyline seen from the harbour. Where the Scenic Railway's timber lattice had climbed above the dunes, visible from the beach, the promenade, and the incoming boats alike, there was now open sky. The fairground continued operating around the gap, its remaining rides smaller, none commanding the same view or the same silhouette. Locals who had marked the horizon by the coaster's turns for a generation now marked it by what was missing. Below the fairground, the Butlins camp kept running through the gap years and into the next decade, unaffected in the short term by the fairground's loss. Opened in 1966, it had grown into a fixture of the annual calendar for Welsh working-class families, a holiday booked a year in advance and returned to on the same week every summer. 800 chalets housed guests who came for the ballroom dances, the redcoat run competitions, the swimming galas, the same rituals repeated season after season until they became indistinguishable from tradition itself. Behind the guests stood the staff who made the rituals possible. Kitchen crews, entertainers, maintenance teams, coach drivers, all cycling through the camp's seasonal rhythm year after year, building their own working lives around its calendar rather than the other way around. For 2 decades, Barry Island's Butlins functioned less like a business than like an institution one families assumed would simply continue. That assumption ended on October 29, 1986, with a single statement issued to staff and press. Barry Island had no place in Butlin's future. The camp would close for good after that Christmas. There was no phased wind-down attached to the announcement, no transition plan, no acknowledgement of the 20 years it was closing out. Only a date, arrived at somewhere else, delivered without ceremony. The language was procedural, the kind drafted by people accustomed to closing facilities on a spreadsheet rather than walking their chalet rows in August. 2 decades of bookings, seasonal employment, and inherited ritual were undone in the time it took to read the statement aloud. The impact landed immediately rather than waiting for the doors to shut. Thousands of seasonal jobs, many held by the same Barry families year after year, were gone the moment the announcement was made, since the camp's final season was already fully staffed and already booked. Cooks, entertainers, and drivers who had spent their winters waiting for summer work found no equivalent trade to fall back into. The final Christmas season ran as scheduled anyway, full and decorated, because the contracts predated the decision to end them. It finished on its calendar date and did not reopen. By early 1987, the headland held 2 absences where 2 enterprises had once stood. No roller coaster above the dunes, no redcoats on the promenade below. The docks, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. Coal, which had built the harbour and financed much of the town's Victorian growth, was approaching its final departure from Barry's quays. Not a gradual decline this time, but a stop, complete within a matter of years. What began arriving at those same quays instead bore no resemblance to coal at all. Chapter 10. What coal and leisure both lost. That departure didn't happen in the 1980s. It had already happened 20 years earlier, while the chalets and the fairground above the docks were still at their busiest. Through the 1960s, coal export from Barry ceased entirely, cargo by cargo, until the trade that had built the harbour stopped moving through it at all. The port that had once led the world in shipping the fuel of empire found itself within a decade shipping almost nothing recognisable as coal. Colliery wagons that had rattled toward the quays for 2 generations grew fewer, then stopped altogether. The hoists built to grip a loaded wagon and tip it bodily into a ship's hold, the machinery that had defined the rhythm of the docks for half a century, fell still over empty berths. Coal dust, once a permanent film over every surface at the waterside, settled and was not replenished. The docks did not close, they changed cargo entirely. From 1959 and continuing into the 1980s, those same berths took in refrigerated ships carrying bananas from the West Indies, consigned to the Geist Company. Nothing about the new trade resembled the old one. Coal had moved by gravity and brute mechanism, tipped and dumped and shovelled. Bananas moved on a clock set by ripeness, unloaded quickly from chilled holds onto conveyor lines and into waiting lorries before the fruit could turn. Wagons gave way to refrigeration units, humming at the quayside. Black dust gave way to the sweet, faintly chemical smell of ripening cargo drifting across berths, engineered for something else altogether. Dockers who had once worked in soot now worked in cold store aprons, moving crates instead of shovelling coal. The volume bore no comparison to what the port had once moved in its Edwardian prime, and it never was meant to. Barry's harbour, engineered for an industry that had made it one of the busiest coal ports on earth, now survived on a fraction of that trade, rerouted into cargo it was never designed to carry. The dissonance was total. Above the docks, on the headland, a different survival was underway. The camp Butlins had abandoned did not stay empty long. Majestic Holidays bought the site and reopened it on 23rd May 1987 as Majestic Barry Island, smaller in ambition, leaner in staff, but built on the same chalets, the same pools, the same promenade that Butlins had spent 3 decades assembling. Where Butlins had drawn holidaymakers from across the country on coach parties and chartered trains, Majestic operated on a narrower reach, closer to a regional summer season than a national institution. Entertainment ran on a smaller scale, fewer staff to fill the same halls, shorter seasons, chalet rows kept open only through the warmer months and shuttered the rest of the year. It carried Butlin's name in nothing but inheritance. It was an attempt to hold what could still be held, not to recreate what had already been lost. For 9 years, majestic Barry Island held on, running each summer on infrastructure built for a much larger operator. Maintenance deferred under one owner became maintenance deferred under another, and the site's post-war structures, never built for indefinite use, absorbed the difference in cracked render, blocked drains, and failing roofs. In 1996, a storm tore through the camp, and what years of postponed repair had already weakened, the weather finished in a single season. Roofs were stripped from chalet rows. Pool halls flooded and stood unusable. Restaurant kitchens took in water through ceilings never meant to hold against weather that severe. Chalets, swimming pools, and restaurants, the entire site closed at once. All of it beyond what remaining funds could repair. Windows stood broken through another winter, pools filled with stagnant rainwater, dining rooms abandoned mid-service, until demolition crews moved in and cleared the site in stages, building by building, down to bare foundations. An ordinary housing estate rose in its place, indistinguishable from 1,000 others built across Wales in the same decade. Streets and driveways replaced it. Below the new streets, the docks were still working, still moving cargo of some description, more than 3 decades after coal had gone from them for good. On the headland, the fairground endured, the one part of Barry Island's leisure industry to outlast both Butlin's and majestic holidays. The beach below remained too, never sold, never demolished, never quite finished with the town that had grown up around it. The beach was about to become famous for a different reason than either coal or a holiday camp ever gave it. Chapter 11. What Remains. The first basin of Barry Docks is gone as a working harbour and remade as a waterfront. Flats stacked where colliers once queued for a berth. Retail units lit where gantry cranes once turned. The second basin survives in industrial use, but nothing black moves through it now. Chemicals come and go. So does timber. Neither cargo announces itself to the town the way coal once did. The tonnage records that once ran to 7 figures a year belong to ledgers nobody keeps anymore. Coal is gone from Barry. It has been gone for decades. Where the chalets of Butlin's once stood in their thousands, close-packed rows the width of a small town, there is now a housing estate indistinguishable from any other built on reclaimed land in South Wales. No fence line marks the old perimeter. No foundation, no sign, no plaque records that 7,000 visitors a week once passed through a gate on this ground. The camp left the island. It left nothing behind. On the promenade, Barry Island Pleasure Park still turns. It is smaller now than it was in the 1930s, when its dodgems and its helter-skelter and its big wheel formed the fixed skyline of the resort's high season. The season itself is shorter, the machinery closed and sheeted over each winter rather than running year-round. What remains open is a fraction of what once stood on that ground, scaled to the crowds that still come rather than the crowds that used to. Of everything Barry Island built for pleasure across a century, this is the one enterprise that never fully stopped. Whitmore Bay remains a working beach, not a memorial to one. It holds a seaside award for the cleanliness of its water and sand, a designation it shares along the same stretch of coast with Jackson's Bay and Cold Nap. The award is renewed each year by inspection, not by sentiment. Visitors still arrive for the day in far smaller numbers than the resort once counted in a single week at its height. The beach carries no plaque marking its Victorian season, its Butlin's decades, or its more recent television epilogue. It simply meets a standard set fresh each year, inspected like any other piece of civic maintenance, its history filed elsewhere. Barry today has a population of about 56,600. Areas of the town now rank among the top 20% most income-deprived places in all of Wales. The same town that once moved more coal than any port on earth. The same town that once counted holidaymakers in the millions across a single season. The tonnage and the visitor numbers are today historical figures rather than a going concern, filed alongside the rest of the record rather than renewed each year. No single industry has replaced what left, and none is expected to. Then, in 2007, a second tourism wave arrived, owing nothing to coal and nothing to a holiday camp. A BBC sitcom, Gavin and Stacey, filmed its scenes on location on Barry Island. The promenade, the arcade, a modest terraced house standing in for its fictional heroine's home. The show made the town a setting rather than a subject, and audiences came looking for it regardless. More than 8,700 visitors have since travelled to see the house used on screen as Stacey's, a private residence turned unofficial landmark by nothing more than a camera pointed at its front door. Tour buses now run a fixed route past the arcade where the character Nessa was written to work, stopping where no dock official or camp entertainer was ever thought worth a coach detour. No plaque marks the dock's record tonnage of a century ago the way a private house on an ordinary street is now pointed out by name from a coach window. A scripted half-hour of comedy has drawn foot traffic to that promenade that neither an actual coal port nor an actual holiday camp managed to keep. The tour still runs on schedule. The tide still goes out twice a day across the sand at Barry Island, uncovering the same crossing that carried the first holidaymakers on foot, long before there was a railway, a causeway, or a coal trade to speak of. At low water, the sand runs pale and flat under the grey Welsh light, marked only by gull tracks and the wet gleam left behind by the retreating sea. A Victorian bathing crowd stood on it, and a Butlin's chalet crowd after them, and a coach party of television tourists after that, each one, in its turn, certain the good years would hold. The water goes out, the water comes back in.